So we're back, and I have another telephone thing to talk about. And I'm actually pretty excited about this because I think it might be a genuinely pretty useful product, not just to me, but to kind of other people who like telephone equipment. So I want to preface this by talking a little bit about why that is. So if you watch like YouTube videos about telephone stuff, I'm sure you've seen this before. You end up in a situation where you've got two pieces of telephonic equipment and you want to make a call between them. You probably don't have landline service to your house. It's getting surprisingly expensive these days. You especially probably don't have two lines of landline service to your house. So how do you actually test or demonstrate equipment, all in a bench setup? Well, kind of the most common answer that a lot of people settle on is using an ATA. I've seen multiple people on YouTube, probably just in the last couple months, I've seen multiple YouTube videos where people are using an ATA to call from a laptop to a modem, to send faxes between two fax machines, any kind of situation where they want to try something out as if they had equipment connected to a central office without actually needing phone lines back to a central office. I would say the ATA approach is okay. The big upside these have is that they're pretty cheap. You can find them used for very little, although I will caution you, because I got burned on this, these newer Grandstream ATAs, and Grandstream is pretty much the only game in town for these now, they can actually be carrier locked. I bought one of this exact model used, found out it was completely locked down. The web interface was disabled. The onboard DTMF menu was disabled. There's no way to configure it. And I came to find out that CenturyLink Business, or I don't know if they're using Lumen for that product line now, if you order business phone lines, this is the CPE they use. A bunch of the ones that show up used on eBay are ex-CenturyLink, and they are locked down like that. There doesn't seem to be any known way to bust them out right now. So I just say if you're buying used Grandstream, or if you're buying Grandstream ATAs in general, I would probably recommend either buying new, because they're not that expensive. I think this, which is 8 ports, is like $140 maybe. Or if you're buying used, just make sure you're getting one that the seller, actually knows whether or not it is configurable. So that's the upside to using these for demonstrating telephone equipment, is that it's a cheap way. A lot of these are 2 and 4 port, but these 8 port ones don't even cost that much. Cheap way to get a lot of ports. And it's not really how these are intended to be used, but it is possible to locally call between the ports. Honestly, I don't remember how to do it on this. I think if you press, I'm going to say it's star star and then 701 through 708 will call directly port to port on this ATA. It doesn't even need to be authenticated to a SIP server for that to work. So in a pinch, it's a pretty good way to just hook up a couple things and call between them. The problem is that these aren't built for that use, and that kind of shows. So there tends to be weirdness. Number one, the dialing scheme to call between ports on these is weird. Number two, I've found before that it's a little bit sketchy. Like sometimes it doesn't work. I don't really know why. I think it has to do with like at what point in the state machine all of the ports are in, whether or not calling between ports actually works. Probably the biggest thing, and I don't know if this is true of all Grandstreams, but it's true of the 2 that I have, is that when you call between the ports on these, they do not pass DTMF. Now, if you think about how these are architected, that actually makes a lot of sense, because typically, when you are pressing digits on a phone hooked up to one of these, it decodes the DTMF and then uses out-of-band signaling, to inform the SIP server that a digit was pressed. So I kind of get why that happens. When you call from one port to another and then push a DTMF key, the decoder actually grabs that and it removes it from the audio. It doesn't appear on the other port. But that's a big limitation if you're messing with like burglar alarms or anything where DTMF signaling is part of the picture. So what should you use instead? Well, the answer to that for a long time has been a telephone line simulator. Several companies have made these historically. Teltone was one of the big ones, and I think Teltone is pretty much the only company that's still manufacturing these. Now, these are great, like they are purpose-built to simulate a central office just for the purpose of calling between a small number of devices. This is a 4-port. I know that there are 2, 4, and 8-port versions that exist. The problem with these is the price. This is a used one. It's a used one with a real C description and all pictures. I think it's actually fine. But they want $175 for it. That is more expensive than this 8-port ATA for a 4-port line simulator with fewer features, basically. And that pricing seems to be, pretty common. These are just a niche product, I guess, and they don't sell enough volume to really drive the price down. So I didn't even find this myself. Actually, a friend of mine sent me a link to this and said, hey, do you know, would this work for... I don't even remember what they were trying to do. I think they might have been wanting to do a little bit of dial-up and see if they could dial from one machine to another. The Mini PABX. These, like a lot of products that are imported from China, they show up under different brand names, but they seem to be identical. This is the Excelltel specifically. There are 2 models of this. There is an 8x2, that means 8 inside ports, 2 central office ports, and there's an 8x3, which is slightly more expensive. When I say slightly more expensive, I believe the prices are $70 and $80. So if this comes through as a $70 device with 8 ports that we can call between, like a telephone line simulator, plus it has CO ports, so we could call out, for example, by hooking those up to an ATA or to an actual, telephone line with service, that's a pretty awesome deal. If this works kind of half as well as it says it does on the box, at least judging by the smiling faces, then I'm going to start telling everyone, stop using ATAs for testing stuff, stop buying the telephone line simulators, get one of these things. So is it worth even the $70? Let's find out. So let's just take a quick look at the box, because this is pretty much the exact same information that you are going to see in the sale listing on these. As I said, this is Excelltel Soho PBX MS208, but if you search for Mini PABX on pretty much any of the usual websites, you'll find this exact same thing. Let's see, ideal for small office and home, call forward, call restriction, call pickup, multiple dial-out mode, DISA mode, operator setting, intercom call, change extension number freely, and simple and easy for installation and programming. That's honestly a pretty impressive feature set. For one, change extension number freely would suggest to me that the correspondence between ports and extensions on this is not actually fixed, like the labeling on it suggests. And that's surprising. That seems like a fairly high-end feature to get in a product that is so inexpensive. And I will say, first impressions are very good. This is a custom-made box, clearly. Fits the product very nicely. The actual device looks uncannily like a PlayStation 2 Slim, to be honest, although it's a little bit thicker than that. And pretty straightforward. We have our... Okay, so you know how I said there's a 2-line and a 3-line CO version? I swear I bought the 2 CO line version, and yet 3 CO lines. That's interesting. I might have to double check. Did I just order the wrong one? But there's 3 telephone jacks for our CO lines. There's 8 telephone jacks for our internal extensions. We have a power input. The DC power supply on this is internal rather than a wall wart. And a mini stereo connection. And it comes in the box with the power cable and the mini stereo connection. The fact that it has ports on it for these is, more commercial equipment. You tend to start seeing the 25 pair connectors with the assumption that they'll go to a punch-down block. But actually, I don't own personally any PABXs that use the 25 pair connectors or are really designed to be used with a punch-down block, because I'm usually buying smaller systems like this, and for just 8 extensions, you are probably not going to do that. I am tempted to sit down and read the entire fairly hefty manual right here with you, but I think I will spare you that gripping part of the video. I'm going to take a flip through this manual on my own time so that I kind of have the general idea of how this thing works. I'll run the air conditioning for a bit so my house cools down, and then we're going to hook this up and we are actually going to give it a try. I am honestly pretty excited about this thing, and if it works out, I will probably be using this in the future for demonstrating other telephone devices, because calling between the ports on this, it's going to be faster. Calling between the ports on this, the way I do it, which is actually going through a SIP server, it kind of takes it an annoyingly long time to connect. There's a couple reasons for that. A couple of them are my fault, a couple of them are SIP's fault. That's 2 couples out of a couple reasons. I could improve it, but I'm probably never going to get this thing to be as snappy about port-to-port calls as a dumb, just kind of local device like this would be. And that would be nice for my videos, huh? If I'm not dialing and then kind of sitting through an awkward pause. So wait a minute, will I read a book even once? You know, there's nothing like sitting down with a cup of coffee and a good book. So I have to say that I am actually quite impressed with this thing so far. The manual is pretty good. It's pretty easy to follow and understand. And the feature list on this is really impressive. It has features that I do not think were mentioned in the Amazon listing or on the box for that matter. For example, it has a basic automatic attendant, which I just did not expect at all. There is one interesting thing that stood out to me, though, reading the manual. I mentioned that the outside of the box said DISA, and that attracted my attention because DISA is a feature of business telephone systems, which is highly subject to abuse. If you aren't familiar with DISA, it stands for Direct Inward System Access. The idea of DISA is that it allows someone to call in to the telephone system from an external line and then dial some sort of code or something that then makes it behave as if they were calling from an internal extension. And usually the most important thing that allows them to do is to make an outgoing call again from the PABX. So let's picture that you are a teenager in the 90s and you would like to make some long-distance calls without racking up a long-distance phone bill. Well, what you do is you find a local business with a small business PBX system with a DISA feature. You call into it, you figure out how to access the DISA. Often there's a password, but often they haven't changed the password and it's 0000 or something. Now you can make outbound long-distance calls, but they're billed to the business that owns the PBX, not to you. Turns out to be a big problem in practice. So it's funny that despite the box saying that this has a DISA feature, I do not see it mentioned in the list of features in the manual, and in fact, I cannot find it mentioned anywhere in this manual except for in this reference table of programming codes, in which it gives us programming codes for no dialing in DISA CO line disconnected and no dialing in DISA transfer to operator. I think it's possible that the DISA feature was actually removed from this product, and that the mention of DISA on the box and in this manual where it does survive is just an oversight. I know that might sound a little weird, but there have been so many abuse problems with DISA. This is not the only, or if I am right about this, this would not be the only small business PABX system I have that used to have a DISA feature, which is either not available on the newer versions or which is not available if you have newer models installed. It's not really unusual for manufacturers to say, that DISA thing may not have been a good idea, and just cut it. I'll poke around a little bit and I'll see if we can find out, but for now, let's just try to get this thing working. I'm sorry that this is going to turn into just a complete tangle of wires, and I don't know how to not have that happen. I'll try to keep it, tamed as much as practical. So this, actually, let me look, does this have a label on the bottom? Yeah, so this is the MS208, and from reading the manual, I kind of figured out what the version number scheme on these is. The 208 means that it is 8x2, that there are 8 inside extensions and 2 outside lines. That's interesting because there are 3 line ports, but I'm kind of thinking, and I think there's an illustration in the manual that reinforces that idea, that the line 3 port on this is just vestigial. I always find it a little bit annoying when the manufacturer leaves on a port that doesn't do anything, but I think that is what's happened here. So I'm going to hook CO line 1 and CO line 2 up. While I'm getting these cables sorted out, let me tell you too, reading the manual led me to discover this has a couple of features that I would not have suspected and that are implemented in subtle ways. And an example is that this has support for door phones and for unlocking a door via DTMF. Now that is a very common feature on PABXs, but from looking at this thing, I would have not guessed that it was possible, and I do not believe it was mentioned on the box or in the Amazon listing. Yet it does. How do they do that? Well, according to the manual, on the CO line 2 port, oh, let's check this out. See, the manual was very confusing about this. The manual made it sound like on either the line 2 or the line 3 port, but I was kind of guessing the line 2 port because I think the line 3 port on this is non-functional, that the outer pins 1 and 4, rather than 2 and 3, which are the phone pair, were actually the relay closure for opening a door. But I'm noticing that the line 2 jack doesn't have pins 1 and 4. It only has, it only has 2 and 3. The line 1 port does have pins 1 and 4. We could also say that this is a 6P4C connector, 6 position 4 contact, whereas line 2 is a 6P2C connector, 6 position 2 contact. So it must in fact be the line 1 port that has the relay closure for opening a door, which is interesting because I think that would make the manual just wrong. A couple other things that we'll want to keep in mind that I learned from the manual as we test this out is that it is the case with most phone systems out there that there is an extension port, which is sort of the, how would I put it, the most important extension port, which sometimes, not always, but often has special privileges for programming the system, and which is the default operator port. I'll talk in a minute about what that means. Most of the time it's the first port, which is marked 601, but for some reason on this system it is apparently 602. So I'm going to plug the neon Conair phone into 602. That'll be our operator position. And the blue Conair phone. By the way, my husband bought me this neon Conair phone. It's got some miles on it, and I had to make some repairs, but I think it's working now, and it sure does look great, doesn't it? I love the era of the transparent electronics. Check out how they made not just the bell, but these bits of metal at the end, which are just weights to make it stay on a desk better. They made them all the neon colors. That is awesome. It used to have a cool sticker on the side that said Conair Neon, but that sticker just did not make it through the years. I gotta see if I can clean up this handset cord too. Maybe the ultrasonic will make it a little fresher looking. So, okay, we've got extension 602, extension 601. This Merlin phone, this is hooked up via the Merlin KSU to the SIP server, so this is going to be our outside phone, essentially. It's also the one that I have the right hardware to record, so we'll get some audio from that. This has the same problem this does, that this phone is not using sort of the conventional signaling from the handset to the base, and that's because the keypad is in the handset on both of these. Most of the time when you have a phone with the keypad in the handset, these types of recording taps that go in line with the handset won't work right. Interestingly, with this phone, it kind of half works, but the keypad doesn't work anymore. So that's interesting. I'd have to sit down and think about why that's what happens. Let's go ahead and power this up, and I have not tried plugging this in before, so we'll see if it lets out any smoke. I don't believe it did. The run light is on. Nope, now it's off. I heard a little bit of a click, so this does have a power failure feature. Once again, with the thing where 602 is kind of the special port, when you cut off the power supply to this, CO line 1 becomes permanently connected to 602. CO line 2 becomes permanently connected to 603. Curious that they just kind of skip 601 for a lot of those features. Let's see if this thing works. I am just going to... Oh, that is a dial tone. Hold on, I'm going to rig up a very ineffective way for you to hear what the inside... I have got to figure out a non... It's ridiculous that the only phones that I have the hardware to record are digital for digital systems, and I can't hook up to this kind of thing. I've got to fix that. But just so you can hear the luscious internal dial phone, the internal dial tone from this, let me do this. Oh, yeah. I'm sure that is lovely. I'm going to find out later that this microphone isn't paired and you couldn't hear any of that. It's just like, it's probably a square wave, actually, by the sound of it. And according to the manual, I should be able to dial between extensions just by entering the extension number by default. Stutter tone. So, I mean, it would appear, line 1, what have I done? When I pick it up, no, that all seems fine. Okay, hold on. We're going to do a little bit of phone clinic. I figured out what was confusing me about our mini PABX, and it's literally just that the correspondence between the labels and the lights here is weird. You'll see the label relates to the light below it, even though at the bottom, because the alignment isn't very good, it is closer to the light above it. Very easy to get confused by that. But once I understood that that's where I was going wrong, I discovered that when I took apart this phone to repair the hook switch, I put it back together so that the bell just, it sounds awful. And I'm pretty sure all that's happening there is that the way I put it back together, the wires are kind of smushed up against the bell and they're preventing it ringing. So I'm just going to see if I can fix that real quick. And you'll get a little bit of a look at the Neon Conair phone, which is older by, I would guess, as much as a decade than this. So we got extension 602 and extension 601. You'll notice that is 602 off hook, not 601, even though it's the light that's right next to 601. Oh, that's funny. It actually timed out on me. You don't get very long to dial. There we go. Don't you love how this has the neons that light up too? Great. This is an awesome phone. And sure enough, I am talking to myself on 2 phones at once. Just to prove it's possible, let's go the other way. Perfect. So one detail that I picked up from the manual is that this device has 7 talk paths. So what do I mean by talk path? Well, let's say that I pick up an inside extension, I dial another inside extension, now we have a connection established. This is one talk path. If I had more extensions, then I might use one of them to make an outside call. That's a second talk path. Older phone systems were often actually pretty limited in the number of talk paths that were available. In a key system, for example, you would typically basically have one talk path for each of your outside lines, and that was just connecting phones directly to those outside lines. And then you would have one intercom line that allowed calls between phones. You shell out a little bit more money, you might get 2 intercom lines. Now, in those devices, the talk paths were essentially equivalent to like the buses in an audio mixer. A talk path meant like a common circuit that it was connecting all of the extensions to. Digital telephone switches, they work quite a bit differently. Most of the time, the way that the switching is happening inside of a device like this is actually by time slot interpolation. So internally, this thing is using time division muxing to basically shove all of the audio samples from every device into one memory buffer. And then in order to send audio from one phone to another, it basically copies a sample from the inbound buffer of that device to the outbound buffer of the next device before the next cycle of receiving and playing back samples happens. I don't know if I just explained that well. Maybe later I'll make a more lengthy video on it. It's an interesting topic because smaller devices like this likely just have one level of time slot interposing. But when you get to very large digital switches, something like a 5 ESS, let's say, it is no longer practical to do all of your switching in one, swapping layer. So you get these sort of more interesting architectures, and a lot of those larger switches use structures that are some sort of variation on what's called time-space-time switching. And that means that sometimes you get like a device that's called the space-time controller, and that's just a funny title, but it's sort of an interesting like hierarchical model of combining multiple time slot interposers and then physically switching the time slot interposers to each other so that you can just get these very, very large switching fabrics. Now, this has a very small switching fabric because it's a very small device, but it's interesting that it has 7 talk paths, considering that there are 8 extensions. You would kind of just expect those numbers to line up better, right? My guess is that the reason is because this has an auto attendant feature. Probably one of the talk pads is dedicated to its internal audio playback. That's just my guess. Other PBXs often have kind of a similar situation where there's internal resources like talk pads or ports that are taken up by their built-in audio player. Could even be that the hold music or something uses one of the talk pads. But we've basically proven out the very first thing that I wanted from this. Obviously, this is not the most interesting demo, but I can pick up a phone. I can call another phone. It rings very promptly, and I'm just going to double check. Ooh, that's loud. The volume on this is way up there. DTMF is passed between devices, so I think we have already basically met the criteria that I wanted to hit with this, which is that this is a very viable alternative, I think, to a telephone line simulator that costs less than half of even what used telephone line simulators tend to go for. And yet, there's so much more than that, because this is a complete PBX. So let's try making an outbound call. So when I was looking at the manual, trying to troubleshoot why it wasn't working earlier, which turned out to be because I don't know how labels work, I noticed that by default, the CO lines are in disabled status. So I am anticipating that if I try to make an outbound call right now, it won't work. By default, it's an indirect dialing out mode. That means we have to prefix our outbound calls with a 9. So let's just give this a try. I'm just going to call them Merlin. Okay, and I'm getting a stutter tone, meaning that it is just beeping repeatedly. I think what we are going to need to do is actually enable the CO lines, and the manual tells us how to do that almost in the very first step. I'm not going to do a lot of like programming in this video because it's not that interesting to watch, but I think I'm just going to show you this enabling the CO lines just so you have the flavor of what the programming process is like on this. So in order to get into programming mode, we need to dial #*. Unless we're in direct dialing mode, in which case we need to dial *#*. I know that just sounded arcane, but it makes a lot of sense. Just the general rule for this, if an extension is set to indirect dialing, then it's assumed that you're dialing internally unless you prefix with 9. If an extension is set to direct dialing, then it is assumed that you are dialing externally unless you prefix with a star. So that's why we have to add an extra star. By default, it's an indirect dialing, so we just need to dial # and then the default password, which is all zeros. And it's gone silent, which I think means we're in programming mode. So let's try enable all CO lines, which is 0600#. And it beeped. And the manual tells us basically that when it beeps at you, that is a good confirmation. We can kind of tell this thing, in a lot of ways, is surprisingly capable, but one thing it does not like to do is audio playback. All of the tones from the system are just affixed. It sounds like a square wave to me. I'm a little disappointed by that. It would have been nicer to get a voice response or at least different tones, like if it could do different frequencies. It's interesting because it obviously does have audio playback hardware since there is an auto attendant feature, but they have clearly reserved it for only that use. So it should be the case that all CO lines are enabled. With PBXs like this is kind of a common scenario. Like you pick up an extension, you try to dial an outbound call, and it doesn't work. And oh, you could be in for a headache because most PBXs have a lot of features that can determine whether or not an outbound call is permitted. That includes, even on this, which is a $70 PBX, that includes class of service for each extension, call restrictions based on prefixes, and there's also a day and night mode, and you can set different classes of service and call restrictions depending on day or night mode. So if you're just like troubleshooting, why can't this phone call out? You got a bunch of things to check, which probably highlights a limitation of this manual because the troubleshooting section is sort of comically short. Let's see. Outgoing calls can't be made. 1. CO line is set to set special extension. 2. Extension hang up improperly. 3. CPU and internal data is disorder caused by unstable power. 4. Call restriction class is 6. So I guess this kind of is telling you, like, check the call restrictions, check the extension configuration, but this is not, I would like a much better checklist of all the things that you need to check, because just from having skimmed this manual, I know that there are things that can prohibit an outbound call. For example, a different class of service in night mode that this is not telling you to check. But let's give an outbound call a try. Oh, perfect. I hit 9. You'll notice that one of the CO lines, line 1, has gone off hook, and I'm now getting an external dial tone, which sounds much better. Oh, hold on. I just got stutter tone from this, though. I'm going to have to look at the manual because I feel like this times out annoyingly quickly. Obviously, normally you would be dialing faster than I am, just doing this demonstration, but I feel like it should give you a little longer. I meant to call this, but just out of habit, I called 1-800-CALLATT. Thank you for calling AT&T. Calls recorded for quality assurance. So yeah, outbound calls work, but let me actually call the Merlin just to give you. And this is the thing I mentioned where when you're using an ATA, it can take kind of a long time. Part of that's because I don't have a dial plan configured on the ATA, so we got to wait a few seconds for it to time out. Part of it is because it's got to connect to the SIP server, which is in Las Vegas, Nevada, which then has to connect back. And now this other phone rings. And indeed, let me put this on speaker just to prove the point better. But indeed, everything works right. No disconnect supervision from the ATA to the Merlin is going to be why we just started getting busy tone from this. But that does raise the question in my mind of whether or not this supports disconnect supervision. I think I explained in the last video what disconnect supervision means, so I'll skip it this time. I could probably make a whole video just about that. It's a whole topic. Let's try an outbound call into this. And what I'm expecting to happen is that the blue Conair phone will ring, and that's because it's extension 602, which is by default the operator extension. Both of them are ringing. That is probably just because I don't remember the default config right, and they're probably in a group that works. I'm talking to myself. So let's talk a little bit about the features that this has related to inbound calling. I am not going to explain all the features that this has. That would take forever. And like, honestly, classes of service, I have a hard time finding classes of service interesting. This even has a very, very emphasis on the very basic form of least cost routing. Um, Obviously, it's very basic, but I wouldn't, I wouldn't expect it to have that at all. So it's a little impressive how many features this has, even though a lot of them are super, super simple. So outbound calling features, I probably won't talk about much other than explaining that you can set an extension to direct or indirect, which basically determines whether or not you need to prefix dial 9. You can also configure which extensions are allowed to use which CO ports. So you could set up kind of more complicated arrangements if you wanted to, where a certain extension outbound calls will always go to a certain CO port. Inbound features are more interesting. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So let's check the default configuration in the manual real quick just to see what it should be doing. Operating mode, all CO line in operator mode. So that means that inbound calls will go to operator rather than going to the automated attendant. And let's see if it tells us anywhere. Original extension number 601 to 608 and operator extension 602. Day-night operator mode, ringing extension. Oh, extension 601 and 602 ring. So one of the features that this has that I would not have expected in it is extension groups. It has 2 extension groups, and you can program which extensions are in each group, and you can configure the behavior of the group. There are 2 options for the extension groups. The first behavior is that all extensions in the group will ring in response to an inbound call. When the first extension is picked up, whichever extension answers first, the others will stop ringing. In the second mode, all extensions will ring. When an extension picks up, the other extensions will continue to ring. And if the users of those extensions answer, they will be conferenced with that inbound call. And indeed, you can have an unlimited number of extensions joined to a conference that way. That's actually a pretty cool feature to have, especially if you were actually going to use this in your house. Like, it would make a lot of sense to use an extension group for answering inbound calls. That way, when someone calls in, all your phones ring. It's kind of the behavior you'd get just when they were paralleled as normal. But that explains why both phones rung, because outbound calls are set to ring both phones. Just because I flipped up to it in the manual, let's just kind of set which extensions ring. So I want to change it so that only 602 are proper operator extension rings. And what I'm seeing is disable number N extension ring when incoming call from number M CO line arrives. So I think I know what we got to do. Let's put this in programming mode. You know what? I think I didn't type this. What did I just do? That's funny. I don't think what I just did is even a valid command. I was supposed to dial 1 after that, but I got a beep like it was okay. That appears to have gotten me an error tone. And here's the thing. I am pretty sure that I have been interpreting these instructions the wrong way around now that I look again. Disable number N extension ring when incoming call from number M CO line arrives. So I should have actually done, just getting us into programming mode, 3, 0, number N extension ring, so 2, 1, 1, pound, long beep. Okay. I said this manual is pretty good, and I do stand by that. It's clearly not written by a native English speaker, but for the most part, it's pretty easy to understand. It does have some issues like that, where it says 30MN1, then it tells you what N is first and what M is second. Very just confusing when you're actually reading it. So let's see if I did that right. We're going to call in and see which phone rings. And the answer is that no phone rings. So do you think that I disabled both of those phones ringing on inbound calls? I think I did. That should have enabled. So let's try calling the first CO line now. and now just the one extension rings. So the manual can be a little confusing, but I don't know. It's good enough, I think. Just mind your M's and N's. So I want to try out the automated attendant. I think that's one of the most interesting features that this has that I did not expect. This system has one channel OGM, including pre-recorded voice and self-recording voice. Pre-recorded voice, system inbuilt voice message. We're gonna listen to that. So I think what we need to do is the first thing we need to do is set what happens when you call the inbound extension. Yeah, so CO line call process in auto attendant mode. Oh, no, that's actually not what we want to do. That determines what happens when someone calls this and the auto attendant is busy. Because there is only one channel of auto attendant, it can only talk to one person at a time. Set operator work mode for certain CO lines. Okay, here we go. Set, it's probably on the previous page. Set auto attendant work mode, OGM. This always says OGM. That means outgoing message. That's kind of what they're calling there. So let's do this. Get into programming mode. 10 pound. That should have set all CO lines to auto attendant mode. So let's give that a try. So it's clear that this is answered, but then it just hangs up. Whoa, there is a recording. Okay, so I think that the custom recording is empty, but it's still trying to use that. Okay, so I was all excited to hear the default message. This is just, I'll say this is a complaint about this product. By default, it had empty recordings. Like when it answered with the auto attendant, it just clicked and then hung up. But I noticed that the manual gives different codes to hear the preloaded recordings, and that worked, so they're clearly there. But it is interesting, there is a code that it gives to clear the custom recordings. And when I did that, now it's using the built-in recordings. So that's kind of just seems like a bug, right? I think you have to do the like reset recordings at least once for it to actually use the built-in ones. And let's just take a moment here and find out what those sound like.
Welcome to call our company. Please dial extension number or dial 0 for inquiry.
Oh, hung up on us. So I think that's because it was not configured for one-digit dialing. That's optional, the auto attendant. So let's try dialing a full extension instead.
Hello, welcome to call our company. Please dial extension number or...
Oh, are you hearing this built-in hold music? Oh, I'm getting a clean recording of this later. That's good. Anyway, let's talk to myself just to prove the point. It works. So let's just talk about a couple of other features that this system has. First off, I want to show you just a really basic PABX feature, which is transfers. And I think I'll show you hold as well, just for a good measure. This is kind of a good example to look at. Obviously, transferring a call is not the most exciting functionality, but it does highlight the difference between a PABX system like this that just uses normal analog phone pairs and a digital PABX, or at least a PABX with a digital control, such as this Merlin, which is a system that was popular in the early 1980s. If you take a look at the Merlin instrument, and this is actually one of the smallest Merlin phones that was made, a lot of them had more buttons than this did, you'll notice that it has a conference button, a transfer button, a hold button, and even a drop button for when you want to hang up on someone and immediately make another call. It's fairly obvious how we might put someone on hold or transfer them using this phone. But when we're using a conventional phone that is just connected via a standard pair, we're very limited in the set of buttons that we get. So how do you transfer a call? If you had advanced calling features on landline phone service and actually used them, which my experience is that that does not apply to very many people, you might have run into this before. Adding any sort of feature set to a conventional analog phone beyond the very basics tends to become very hacky and relies on a mechanism called flashing. Now, I will say, while flash is the conventional term, this manual actually calls it padding hook, which I rather like. If anything, I think padding might be more descriptive and less silly than the label flashing. But to start out, let me tell you what it is that flashing meant. A lot of phones, and I'm going to see, I think both of these that I have in front of me are a little too old to be an example. Quite a few phones were made that had a dedicated flash button on them, and that might have led to some misconceptions about what flashing meant. Padding the hook is actually quite accurate. I'll tell you how you flash like that. All a flash really is depressing the hook switch for just a short period of time. The term flashing comes about, at least the common story is, because of operators sitting at plug boards where they had a light that indicated when a phone was off hook. The idea is that if you were in a phone call and wanted to get the operator's attention, you would tap your switch hook, which would cause a light to flash on the operator's plug board and hopefully get their attention. The way we use it today tends to be quite a bit different. We can just configure a phone switch so that it doesn't consider a phone to have truly gone off hook, or just to truly have gone on hook, sorry, unless it's actually been on hook for at least like a second or something. That's probably a good idea anyway, as basically a debounce, and it allows us to overload those short hook switch depressions to do other things. So let's work an example. I'm going to call our extension 601 from an outside line. Okay, 601 is ringing, and I'll go ahead and answer. I'm now talking to myself. Let's say that I realize that our hopeless inbound caller has dialed the wrong extension like an idiot, and we need to send them to another department. How would we do that? Well, we simply flash the hook switch, which restores our internal dial tone and puts the caller on hold. And then we dial the extension they should have called, which is now ringing. When we pick up that extension, we should now be on the line with our caller. It's sort of interesting that that didn't happen until I put this extension down. A lot of phone systems offer two different types of transfers, an attended transfer and a blind transfer. In an attended transfer, you are essentially put in a temporary three-way conference. That way, when you transfer someone to another extension, you can actually hear the person on the other extension pick up and talk to the caller. That's a really useful feature in a receptionist scenario, because that way the receptionist can actually tell if the person answered, They can tell if they got the right person. And then if no one answers or they've made a mistake or something, they're still on the line with the caller so they can help them out. You will also notice that you virtually never encounter that happening, and that's because a blind transfer is so much easier for the person doing it. When you do a blind transfer, you're essentially just throwing the call away to someone else. You send it to the other extension, that person might answer, they might not. You don't know, you don't care. It's probably a worse experience for the caller, but to be fair, most of the time the person you're transferring to probably has voicemail. So if they don't answer, then their voicemail is what's now taking care of the caller. This system doesn't seem to differentiate, and I think that in practice, it's doing kind of an odd halfway between. When I dialed another extension on this phone, I got a stutter tone on this phone until this extension picked up. Then I got a solid tone, and this extension didn't seem to be on the line with the caller until I hung this phone up. I believe that after I transferred a caller, if the other extension didn't pick up, which I would know by the persistent stutter tone, I think I could actually use a command to retrieve that call. There's a few other types of transfer that this supports. For example, it supports what they call secretary function. That sounds kind of funny, but I think I've actually seen other PBX manuals call it secretary function too. Let's just try out the secretary function. I think that'll give you the idea of what it does. Let's say I pick up our extension, I dial an outbound call. We'll go ahead and answer that as our outside caller. And now, as the secretary, I can say, please hold for the President of the United States. Flash, dial another phone. This is the President speaking. What I've really done is I've just transferred a call, but in this case, it was an outbound call that I transferred. That often gets called the secretary function because probably the most common way that it gets used is when someone is, I don't know, too lazy to dial their own phone and they have their secretary make a call for them. That used to be, I'm being a little dismissive, that used to be a way more common thing you would do back when people had secretaries because people didn't used to have voicemails. So if you were trying to get a hold of someone, you might just have your secretary call them over and over again until they were actually able to get them on the line, and then they'd send it over to your phone. There's one other feature on this that I think is worth demonstrating to you, and that is going to be hotline functionality. Because hotline functionality is kind of neat. A lot of phone systems have it. I think a lot of people don't realize that a lot of phone systems have it. It's probably one of the cooler tricks that you can pull with a cheap PABX like this that's actually useful in a lot of real-world scenarios. Okay, after consulting the manual, I have enabled the hotline feature for our extension 601. So let's see what happens when I try to use it. Immediately, 602 rings. The term hotline is overloaded in a confusing way in the telephone world. Historically, it has meant several different things. In common parlance, it means one thing, and when programming PBXs, it mostly means another. The kind of most common meaning of hotline, specifically in the context of business phone systems, is a phone that automatically dials a call as soon as you take it off hook. So you don't have to dial this phone at all, you just pick it up, and now this other phone is ringing. The hotline feature on this is somewhat limited. There's only one destination that hotline phones can call, and that is the operator extension. Now, you can have as many hotline phones as you want, but all of them, when picked up, will call the operator extension. Still, that's a pretty useful feature. You see this used a lot with door phones, and in fact, the door phone feature that this has is basically just a way that they've sort of overloaded its hotline feature. Most of the time when you have a door phone, you want it set up so that as soon as someone picks up the phone, it's automatically ringing a phone at the security desk or the reception desk, someone who can let them in. It's also pretty handy if you're just really standoffish and want to make sure you never see your DoorDash drivers. Just put like a weatherized phone out at the curb for them to pick up and call you. I'm going to reassure you I've not actually done that, because now that I say it, it sounds so much like the kind of thing that I would do. There are just two final features that I'm going to briefly tell you about on this device before we wrap up. Number one, I pointed this out when looking at the box. When you look at the back of this device, the internal ports are labeled 601 through 608, and indeed those are the extension numbers that correspond to them. When I bought this, assumed that that would be a fixed mapping. For example, on the telephone line simulators I'm familiar with, it is. But on proper PABX systems, it is very common to have a layer of abstraction between the physical ports on the device and your extension numbering. There's a couple of different reasons for that. One is that when you're installing a PABX, there's a substantial chance that it's replacing an old PBX, and it's very convenient if you can adjust its internal dialing scheme so that it behaves the same way that the old PBX did, and people don't need to learn new habits. The other reason is because you might have employees who move between offices. And when that happens, it saves you a lot of effort if you can just program the PABX to swap where their extension number dials instead of actually having to recable their phone so that they're on the same port they used to be. This does indeed have extension remapping, and it's actually more flexible than I had guessed. Not only can you remap the 3-digit port numbers to other 3-digit extension numbers, you can also map them to 4-digit extension numbers. So you can even essentially reconfigure this for 4-digit internal dialing if you want to. Pretty neat. This also has an onboard speed dial capability. Weirdly, it's described in an appendix of the manual instead of in the main instructions. I don't really know why that is. It kind of feels like the appendixes in here are just things that they forgot to add until later. But you can set this up so that an internal user can pick up their phone, dial just a 2-digit number, and then that will dial a pre-programmed external call. It's a convenient little time-saving feature. You see that used sometimes in a hospitality context in hotels to make it easier for people to call to internal services. But you also see it used in businesses sometimes so that you can just put a sticker on the monitor that says that if you can't log into the computer, you should dial, 77 instead of people having to dial some full number for whoever your help desk provider is. One last thing I'll throw in about this, just a boring little compliance detail because I love to bring up boring little compliance details. I mentioned earlier, extensions can be set to either indirect dialing or direct dialing. That determines whether or not it is necessary to press the 9 prefix before making an outside call. There has been a requirement in the United States for, I'm not exactly sure how long now, but I think it's been at least a decade, that picking up an internal phone and dialing 911 needs to work correctly. Users should not be required to prefix emergency calls with any sort of dialing prefix. I am sure you can imagine why that is. It serves a meaningful safety function. I did a quick little test by going to my Asterisk server and disabling its outbound trunk just to check the behavior. This particular PABX is not compliant. When an extension is set to indirect dialing mode, which is the default, dialing 911 will get you a stutter tone error. So if you are going to use this device in a real business context, if you want to avoid an extremely remote chance of getting a nasty gram from the FCC, probably a much higher chance of getting the living daylight suit out of you if someone does try to call 911 and encounters a problem, you'll want to set all of your internal extensions to direct dialing mode. That means that internal calls will need to be prefixed with a star, but at least emergency dialing will work correctly. So what's the bottom line? I'd give the PABX parentheses telephone exchange model MS208 5 out of 5 stars. It has a substantial portion of the features that you would find in a considerably more expensive PABX system. Most of them seem to work okay, and it's less expensive than not just a telephone line simulator, but it's even less expensive than a lot of your ATA options, especially if you are limiting yourself to buying used, for example, because you're afraid of ending up with something CenturyLink carrier locked. So I would say if you are looking to test or demonstrate telephone equipment, picking one of these up as an alternative to a more expensive device is a total no-brainer. I think this would even make sense for use in kind of a home lab sort of setup if you're experimenting with dial-up or that sort of thing, because calling between extensions really is very fast. I have not really found any problems with this so far. There's a little bit of weirdness I've noticed if it receives two inbound calls in rapid succession. Sometimes it's a little weird about when it answers the second one. I think that's just an artifact of how it manages the fact that the auto attendant can only handle one channel at a time. There's actually a couple different options in the manual for changing that behavior, so you can probably make it work how you want it to. I think my only serious complaint about it is that the timeout on dialing really does feel short. I think it's only a few seconds, and I couldn't see in the manual any way to configure that. I also want to follow up on the DISA because anytime that I see DISA in the instructions for something, it excites me. I want to find out that there's a DISA with some default password that no one's ever going to remember to change. I'm not sure if the person who wrote the box and one section of the manual for this just didn't really understand what DISA meant, or they were using it in an unusual way, or if it's a feature that they removed. I can't find any way that you would enable DISA, and I've done kind of the standard experiments of calling it on an outbound line and using different, pressing pound, pressing star, pressing pound star, pressing star pound. Nothing has gotten me anything that seems like it's external access to programming or to outbound CO lines or anything like that. So I think that there just isn't really a DISA capability in this device. That's probably better in the long run anyway. I think I'll pretty much wrap up with that. If I was a little smarter, maybe I'd like give you an affiliate link to this thing, but honestly, I just don't want to sell my soul in that particular way. So instead, let's talk about the other way that I sell my soul. I will link you to my Ko-Fi. I personally refuse to pronounce it coffee, no matter how much they want you to. And that's after I give my friends a hard time for saying letterbox D instead of letterboxed. If you'd be willing to spare like $5 a month to support my work, that gets you a few things. Number one, it gets you the warm, fuzzy feeling of allowing me to afford the much more expensive co-location situation that I'm currently moving into. It supports my writing. It supports my making YouTube videos like this, which even for how low effort this might seem, are remarkably time consuming. I have spent like a whole weekend day working on this so far. But it will also get you access to Eyes Only, my supporters only newsletter. I try to send something out about once a month. I might actually be doing closer to 2 times a month in practice. That's where I put things that I think aren't really long enough or polished enough to make for a computers are bad article, but are also still too long to just be some ugly Mastodon thread. And of course, I suppose you can always support me the good old fashioned way by liking, subscribing, commenting. As I understand these days, you also have to ring that bell. And even then, I don't know if it actually works. Thank you for calling JB Crawford. Please dial an extension for whichever room you think I might be in right now.
sorry, the extension you dialed is not answered. Please dial other extension number or call later. Thank you.
Huh, must have guessed wrong.